Hey, folks, we're just going to get started here in just a minute. So we're just having a little bit of fun with the DNS name. And so here's a fun topic to chew over while we're doing that. Remembering how to flush the cache in different versions of OS X for DNS cache. That's a fun one. Sujan, I know when I was dealing with older versions of Mac OS, there were different commands you would use to kill the DNS cache because they've changed the service over the years. So every operating system version, I'm like Googling DNS flush cache OS X, Big Sur. And so now I found that. So apparently it is this command here, which I'll put in the chat if anyone really cares. It's kind of fun.
I love when the abstractions get leaky and then you got to start understanding how things actually work. Like, oh yeah, okay, what's DNS? What's the cache? How does the OS work? How does it do networking? It's a great way. Many years ago, that's how I got into learning some networking stuff.
Yeah, right, exactly. Just because, like, why does it do what it does?
Because JVM had its own settings for DNS, and then Windows had its own settings as well, and you had to understand how both worked.
Right. Let's see if I can. 2021. Can you? Oh, you're not out of the office. Hey, Becca, our producer extraordinaire. Bring her back on. Becca. Hi, Becca.
Hey.
Becca, everybody. Becca, can you, from your place there, can you hit 2021.phillymergingtech.com announcement? I'll bet you can. I think it's our internal DNS.
Yeah, I can see it.
All right. Hey, we're going to start off this way. Welcome to Tech Chat Tuesday. My name is Ken Rimple.
Sujan Kapadia.
And we are here today to talk about some dev news. So a couple things up front. Let me go ahead and, well, I can't share the screen, but maybe, Becca, can you share the screen of 2021.phillymergingtech.com? We are announcing officially that Philly Emerging Technologies for the Enterprise Conference is coming up on May 4th through 6th, 2021. The site is launched. If you go to phillyemergingtech.com, it should take you to 2021.phillyemergingtech.com. We put every year in there as a separate site, and there it is. So there's an early bird of $70. We are doing one more virtual conference just because we don't know when everyone's going to get vaccinated, so we can't be sure. And look at who one of our featured keynotes is. This is a major event. So we were actually able to reach out to Alan Kay, who basically helped invent personal computing. He was working at Xerox PARC on the object-oriented programming ideas, and also creating the first graphical user interface at PARC, which was then taken by Apple to create the Macintosh. He had the 2003 Turing Award for pioneering many of the ideas at the root of contemporary object-oriented programming languages, etc., and fundamental contributions to personal computing. We reached out to him and we said, you know what, we would love to have your perspective and retrospective on things. And he was kind enough to say, yes, he would absolutely be interested in doing that. Yeah, so that's huge.
We're going to get him. It's amazing. I wouldn't mind hearing his perspective on anything.
I know. Yeah, he can talk about how cheese sandwiches are made. I'll be like, tell me more. So we have him already, and I've reached out to Brian. Brian Getz is in again. He's a Java language architect at Oracle. We just did an event with him recently about Java 25, but he's going to speak about some advanced Java technology. We have the ClojureScript lead developer, David Nolan, who's always a great speaker. Matthew, I think Hawthorne, I think is the name, and there's one more confirmed, Limay Nasri, who we know. So far that's 5. We're going to have, I think, about 30 speakers. Keep looking there. You can register early. It's a nice, affordable online conference. We're going to spread it out across 3 days. And $70 early bird special. You can get on it right now and register to get your seat. Again, that's in May 4th to 6th, 2021. Thank you, Becca. All right, great. So that's that. And you can unshare it. I'll share my screen then. Thanks. And let's see here. So if you want any other info, so for example, let me just go here to this browser. Someday I'll be faster than this. Don't hold your breath, everybody. So that's it right there. So if you go to chariotsolutions.com and you turn off the debug. There we go. If you hit chariotsolutions.com, there is a resources tab. You'll find all the stuff we write and talk about and all of our events there. So for example, we've got blog articles. We've got a couple of videos that we recently put up there. We also have our podcast there on your podcast. So if you found this on Google and you want to subscribe to it, if you just go to chariotsolutions.com, you can go to the resources podcast, hit the RSS feed or iTunes feed, and it'll take you right there to subscribe. And so that's what's going on. With that, let's start with our first news article. So, Sujan, why don't you talk to us a little bit about Gmail and YouTube and all sorts of other stuff being down? Yes.
Sure. So I think the other week, or maybe 2 weeks ago, I don't remember now, we talked about, the AWS outage. And I think there's definitely like an outage somewhere going on every week. The whole world runs on cloud services now, so the impact is definitely huge. But Google had a service outage, which for folks, depending on where you are in the world, may have not impacted as much. It happened really early in the morning, I think a day or two days ago. But it affected Gmail, YouTube, Google Docs, or as they like to say, services requiring users to log in. Okay, there's a lot of services that require a user to log in.
Yeah, right.
It's pretty funny. It made it sound like it wasn't a big deal. But what the underlying root cause is an authentication system failed due to internal storage quota-related issue. I didn't do any more digging than that, but it was interesting that this was also falls under like capacity, right? Planning and capacity constraints, where the AWS-related outage, they were dealing with the number of threads running on that OS on an EC2 instance or whatever it was for dealing with essentially handling DynamoDB shards. So, or Kinesis, maybe, I forget now. But,
or whatever the database is, yeah, right.
But anyway, that was also really the OS threading related capacity thing, and they ended up adding beefier instances with more memory, and so they can run, and then they're going to re-architect it to cut down the number of threads that need to be run because they're going to have larger machines, less machines. But anyway, this was also capacity related storage quotas. So this one was like, okay, this cloud thing has real things running on Metal that actually write bits and bytes to real things, and it does impact at the end of the day. It's not just this infinite resource pool that it just you snap a finger, wave a magic wand, and a new machine and disk appear. Like there are actually people managing this, working on it day and night. So kudos out to, I just want to say to all the engineers, all the SRE, all the DevOps,
absolutely,
all the people, all the security guards at these data centers that are working during COVID and stuff, like everyone out there that's actually running the cloud for us so we can live the lives and do the work we do. I mean, hats off to you. We really don't recognize you guys enough, and you guys deserve a lot of the credit for everything we do in our lives. So these things are going to happen. I don't think it's anyone's fault. We just have to be aware of what can happen and how to deal with it when it happens, and have alternate workarounds for our own things that we're working on or where we're storing our data and things like that. So,
yeah, totally agree, and absolutely, the work they do and the risk they put themselves under sometimes for the things they have to do, even bad weather and things like that. Just keeping the systems up it's really important. There are a lot of people that rely on them. The way I found out about it was I got an email from our vice principal saying, it's down, we can't use anything. And by the time I checked, it was up again. So, hey, that was a very fast outage. They got it resolved. And, it's interesting. This is yet another one of those cases where it's an authentication system, right? So one of the things that caused the falling over of the AWS stuff the other day was that Cognito couldn't work because it was bound up just trying to get a resource for, I think, logging, right? And so it couldn't even handle security connections, and that brought a lot of stuff down. So this is something I think a lot of these engineers are really going to start thinking about, these choke points more, and they do anyway. When they fail, they address them. But this is yet another kind of interesting. It's interesting is that had a role in this one as well, even though it was Google. So, okay, cool. So that's what, we have a link to the TechCrunch article kind of talking through it a little bit. And there's also an interesting status page. I forget where it is. But this might be it. Yes, this is it. So the starting come back again link. There's your Google Workspace status dashboard. And you can see when an event happened over a calendar time, you can kind of take a look and see where the problem is and what services. It's kind of interesting. And all these major cloud providers have these status pages that you can go to, and I'm sure they have it in JSON format and other things as well. Okay, here's an interesting project out there, and it's just kind of grist to kick around some of these things. I work with Docker a lot, and I've been working with building, Docker images for some of my AWS projects. Instead of picking some off the shelf, just figured, I can take a base and add exactly what I want in and get what I need. And HexOps has a project called Dockerfile out there, which is Dockerfile best practices. And his line here from HexOps Dockerfile, the project on GitHub, is writing production-worthy Docker files is unfortunately not as simple as you would imagine. Most Docker images in the wild fail here, and even professionals often get. I love these little links. Get this wrong. Different issues that fail, which could be fun to read. And so he has some best practices for writing Docker files that SlimSag is the name of the user on Twitter, I guess, have quite painfully learned over the years, both from his personal projects and his work on SourceGraph. It's just a guidance, not a mandate. So if you look at the practices he has in here, this makes a lot of sense. Let's make the font a little larger. One is run as a non-root user on Docker, and that just protects you from kind of getting a process that gets like the root account and does bad things on that Docker instance and has more privilege than it should. To that aim, using a user ID below 10,000, that's kind of like one of the system usernames, ID-wise perhaps. And he goes into degrees here about what's going on. A static UID and group ID. Don't use latest. This is like every other piece of software we work with, right? So if you're working with Maven builds, if you're working with NPM or whatever, it's easy to say this, but sometimes you get a false sense of security that everything's been working for a couple months and you don't look at those files. But having like a variable version in your versions and things is just going to make it break at some point. And latest is a bad one because that means it doesn't matter what release it is. It's just the latest one that was pushed up to the Docker. There's apparently a Tiny process. I'm going to click on this one because I'm kind of curious. I haven't used Tiny. Let's see. So Tiny as the entry point in your Docker file, and I probably should know this, but hey, I'm learning while you're learning. He's got a small little init for containers. So I'm going to look at this myself. I haven't seen this before. Let's post that. Beck, I'll throw that in there too. As another thing to put in the links. So it's like a tiny initializer to run your program. And so you have an entry point that then runs your command, and the entry point is tiny, right? So that's the way Docker works, is the entry point's the thing that kicks off, and then that entry point will run whatever command you pass it if you do it this way. And so this is kind of make sure that it's a safe initialization of the program. So that's good to know. And then only store arguments in CMD, but don't put them in the entry point. So it allows people to ergonomically pass arguments to your binary without having to guess its name. So you can say Docker run your image, and then because your entry point is already fixed into what it's going to be, your command is like the default options. And I've done this. It demands your default options. You're going to pass it. And then you can add. So if you're not a Docker person, this is like, what are you talking about? But go ahead.
Is this like BusyBox or totally different?
No, I don't think he's even saying that. I think Tiny is just an initializer. I think it's something you would install. So I'm guessing if I go up and look at the Docker file, we'll look at that in a second. It's probably installing Tiny in that Docker image, I would bet. And then, it says install bind tools, I guess, if you've got DNS resolution on older Docker versions, but okay. And let's see. Is Tiny still required in 2020? I thought Docker added it natively. Unfortunately, although Docker did add it natively, it is optional. You have to pass init to the Docker run command. So what he's saying is if you put Tiny in directly, so there's the answer. If you put Tiny in directly in the entry point, you don't have to pass init in. Therefore, you can make the command all the things that are optional and overridable. So this is interesting. It's an interesting little post here in a Docker build. And so, something to chew on. Ours, 18,000 or so organizations downloaded backdoor planted by Cozy Bear hackers. Oh boy, what happened?
So a lot of large companies, Fortune 500 companies, the government, like, Homeland Security, et cetera, a lot of their networking infrastructure, their routers, their switches, a lot of their machines use SolarWinds software to do network monitoring, like, basically SNMP traps and getting all that kind of information and sending it back. So, not only are there SolarWinds servers, there's a software called Orion that had the backdoor installed, and then agents that get installed on the things that are actually, that they're collecting metrics from. Anyway, there was a backdoor that was planted as part of a software update. And I'm hearing an echo. Is that okay?
It's me here. I'll turn down my audio while I talk. Go ahead.
Sorry about that. That would stay dormant for 2 weeks. And then, after 2 weeks, it pops up and basically starts sending traffic to this other domain, but it looks innocuous because it's sending data that looks like it's just part of the normal data that SolarWinds sends. So I think it affected, like I said, 18,000, and they had this basically remote backdoor that they can now get into and execute things. Now, the really scary thing I found, of course, all that should scare you, is it also stole SAML certificates. So the signed certificate. So once you have a signed certificate, you can generate your own users, and they're trusted because they're signed by a trusted certificate. So now, it had this backdoor, it had this update, it was dormant for 2 weeks. Now it has a stolen certificate. So they could essentially take over networks, and remember the routers and switches, et cetera, that are running, they're already privileged. Like they're internal privileged. So it's really scary in my opinion.
Yeah, you don't know how far this has reached. You really don't. Yeah. And I remember hearing the SolarWinds tripped my memory because this was the breach that happened where the Treasury and Commerce and Homeland Security departments were hit with this. And so that was the first place I heard of it a day or two ago. This is a big deal. So let's see. Yeah, that's scary. Okay. Well, hey, talk to your network admin and see if they use SolarWinds. That's the thing, right? All these different exploits, SNMP traps. SNMP is a simple network monitoring protocol for people who haven't run into it. It's what network operations use to make sure they know when things fail, if they're alive, to ping to see what status they have, get metrics out of them. And so talk about like a built-in protocol for the whole internet. That's a scary one.
Yeah.
Wow. All right. Goodbye, CentOS. Hello, Rocky Linux. This is a ZDNet article. So apparently Red Hat recently announced it was shifting focus from CentOS Linux to the Red Hat Enterprise Linux, that they're looking at. They've been running that for years as like their big commercial version. Then CentOS was their open source version. And a lot of Docker containers early on were using it. A lot of VPSs that people would put together would be running CentOS. And so apparently the co-founder of CentOS, Gregory Kirsner, heard that, and he said, I'm going to create my own Red Hat Enterprise Linux clone called Rocky Linux. I guess it's like the underdog fighter. Da-da-da. We're in Philly. Come on. Da-da-da. Anyone know? But anyway, so Rocky Linux. Kirshner, whose day job is now CEO and founder of Control Command, said, in quotes, I was just as shocked as the rest of the community when the news from Red Hat. When I started CentOS 16 years ago, I never imagined the incredible reach and impact it would have around the world on individuals and companies who rely on CentOS for Linux distribution. And there's a lot. So anyway, keep in mind, if you're using CentOS at this point, you probably have to figure out whether you're going to migrate to Rocky or if you're going to ultimately go to Red Hat Enterprise Linux and pay the licensing fees. But at least, the co-founder forked and did another version. And it says, let's see, already there are 650 would-be contributors. Not bad for a project that's less than 48 hours old.
Wow.
Pretty amazing. So keep in mind, if you were on CentOS, pay some attention to this because at some point you may not be on CentOS, or what's more important, you may not get patches at some point. So just keep that in mind. Pay attention to what they're doing with it and how they're closing it down, and make sure you pick a path. Specifically, it seems like Rocky Linux might be a path to pick, but Rocky would be forked by this co-founder and it wouldn't be run by Red Hat. So it would be a different support team too. Something interesting. All right. So now Facebook's getting too big. What's going on?
Yeah, so I didn't.
Not surprising.
Read the entire article because I got bored after the first few.
Yeah, from technologyreview.com. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But it's a great website, actually. It's MIT Tech Review.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Facebook has obviously WhatsApp and Instagram and probably a bunch of other things I don't even know about, but they're really large when it comes to all the things you communicate on. Facebook is more for people like me and you.
Yeah, right.
Young bucks out there don't use it as much anymore. They use Snapchat and other things, but Instagram is like exploding in popularity. It's insane. I actually don't use it.
Yeah.
But and WhatsApp, which the whole world uses, which I do use to communicate with people, family and stuff in other countries. So anyway, Facebook has a large hold on what most people use still to communicate these days. And the FTC is essentially saying that's a monopoly and is stifling competition. And Facebook, is buying companies to stifle competition. And I think in the past, they were able to agree on certain things and kind of grease each other's palms. But now I don't think that's the case. And FTC really wants to review everything. And it looks like they're serious about threatening Facebook and disbanding these things and breaking them up. So I don't know what that'll mean for the future of communication and stuff. It's nice that people are looking at it and the government is concerned about one company controlling what most people use for a communication platform. At the same time, they are really useful platforms. So what also concerns me is what comes out of this. Like, it's not just going to be breaking up companies. Like, is it going to change the software? What are people going to be allowed to, not allowed to do? We were talking about backdoors earlier. Our government's going to ask for backdoors to be installed. Are they going to be collecting data as well from doing the searches and forensics around this? Anyway, I mean, hopefully it, generally speaking, goes in a good direction. So we'll see.
Yeah, it's just something to watch and keep an eye on as things are shifting around. What changes on the ground for us, for example. There's a lot of this aggregation of companies like Amazon buying companies and Google and a bunch of other organizations just gobbling up smaller companies as a way of growing.
Yeah. So I feel like maybe something like that. Someone acquired, like Salesforce bought Slack recently, and they start buying a lot of stuff, and the same thing happens. So a lot of companies use these packages, right? So they rely on it. So it concerns me that things can be yanked or stopped. So I don't know, if I were a small company, I probably would look at running things locally to a certain degree, maybe Discord or something. And do we have to be dependent on some large cloud services for communication, or can we run our own infrastructure and make sure it's secure? And, is that worth it? Are we going to be any more secure than these large companies that have 24/7 workforces making sure things are okay? But it makes me think a little bit more about stuff like Discord.
Yeah, I understand that. That makes some sense. And some of these things, like, for example, you look at Slack and its licensing fees and stuff, and you look at, other kind of collaborative tools and how, as they went to the cloud, as they scale up, things can get it's really cheap to start, but they get really expensive later. Like running something open source in your own network it's almost coming back into vogue. Maybe a little, I don't know. Private cloud, public cloud, offline cloud. What am I doing? All right. Interesting article though. All right. Maven Daemon. Anybody still use Maven? The answer is going to be most people in the enterprise are either using that or Gradle if they're Java developers. So it turns out that there's this open source project. I believe it's an Apache project. And what they're doing is they're taking techniques from Gradle and another tool I've never used called Takari. And so the idea is that it's a daemon that runs that embeds Maven. So you download it and it has Maven embedded. There's a background process that's long-lived, and it can conserve multiple requests from the client tool called MVND. It's written using GraalVM. Now, GraalVM is a runtime that basically compiles down to machine code as opposed to just byte code. If I remember correctly, it's a much faster, or at least internally, it optimizes the machine to assemble your machine code. It's a very fast VM from Oracle. That is an alternative to the JVM or the regular OpenJDK JVM. It starts faster and uses less memory comparing to a traditional JVM. And so the interesting thing here is that it caches everything as it builds. And this is probably what Gradle does too, is that as the jars are being loaded for build, it'll cache them, keep them around in memory so that the next time you hit save, it doesn't have to scatter load a bunch of jars from an SSD or disk. Now, somewhere in here, they were talking about some speed. And, oh, by the way, if you use SDKman, which is a tool that installs all sorts of Java-related tools, it's kind of like the brew for the JVM set. You can install it from SDK using SDK install MVND. Now, I'm trying to find here. There was something about this tool. It was some ridiculously fast build speeds. And now I won't find it. But the bottom line is that what it will do is, because everything is so cached, that we're talking about things that could take 30 seconds normally, taking like a quarter of a second to half a second once everything's loaded into memory. So this is the kind of tool you want to use as a developer. If you're doing Maven every day, you can look at this as an alternative to start off Maven and maybe really speed up your builds.
Let's look at that. So is that the question? Is that,
and I've not used it. Go ahead.
Or is it doing like incremental compilation as well?
I don't know that it can. Well, I mean, if you think about the Maven Java compile task, it does incremental compiles, I believe, by default anyway.
Okay.
So it should just do them, but everything's now cached. So
Okay.
that could be a huge increase in speed. I know that's the biggest thing. Whenever I worked on a Spring project in more recent times, I'm like, I got to do a Maven build. And I used to teach and consult using Maven all the time. But things have gotten just so much faster. It's good to know that there actually is a tool out there from Apache that's starting to come out that might really speed that up for people too. So enterprises rejoice, I think. Hey, what is CockroachDB? It's got the best name of any open source tool I've ever heard. What is that?
I will. Give me 1 second.
I mean, to me, it says it's going to survive forever. That's my first thought. Like, you can't kill it, you know?
Oh, I didn't even. Funny you say that. I wasn't even. That's funny. I never considered that.
You know, the things that'll be around after nuclear war will be like cockroaches, and you know, Rick rolling videos will still somehow get preserved. I guess, I don't know. We won't be around, but they'll just be playing on a loop. So this is scalable spatial indexing in CockroachDB. Go ahead.
I haven't used CockroachDB myself, but one of their kind of things, or their shtick, is like an ACID compliant NoSQL database, right?
Okay.
So they're guaranteeing like strong consistency, strong writes. And I think that a lot of cloud providers have played around with them, and a couple startups that I know have used this successfully for like really large scale deployments. You know, it does dynamic kind of horizontal scaling by sharding and kind of handles all that kind of behind the scenes and guaranteeing ACID. Again, I haven't looked at the Jepson report for CockroachDB to see like what he found. But anyway, what pertains to this article is spatial indexing. So a couple of our projects, we actually use PostGIS on Postgres to do geospatial indexing. And if, for those that don't know, spatial indexing is a way to basically answer a way to store data, so you can answer queries like, hey, where is this located, or how far is X from Y, or tell me like all the things that are located 5 miles within this point. So you can run basically spatial queries. And you can imagine a lot of things are location-based these days. So it's a critical feature or capability to have for a lot of software out there. And it just becomes more and more as the number of mobile devices and IoT increases. But anyway, I thought this article was interesting. Any article where they talk about why and how they made an architectural decision and they describe it, I always consider golden. Because sometimes all you get is the how-tos, or like, okay, do this, but not like, how did we arrive to this architecture? So they go through 2 different types of spatial indices. One is called divide and conquer, one's dividing space. So there's basically, the one case which Postgres uses, PostGIS, is very data dependent. So it looks at the data and basically creates an index based off of where the actual points are spatially. The second approach, which you can do, that first approach is essentially called R trees. The second approach, which Cockroach is using, is another very popular one called quad trees, where you're basically dividing a fixed bounded space into quarters. So for each point, it has 4 children, saying like, you know, basically 4 quadrants. So every time you add in a new point, you go down, you're breaking the space into 4 more, and you're indexing that way. So it's always fixed, and your IDs that get generated are near each other, numeric, like spatially. So you can run range queries very easily. The numbering is consistent. It's more space efficient, and very importantly for Cockroach, is it's not sensitive to scale. So if you're adding nodes, removing nodes, like actual machine nodes, and have to like rehash the data, it doesn't change this index. You don't have to re-index everything and figure out where does this point now go into this new index. It can withstand scaling up and down. So that's why they chose quad trees over the R trees. But anyway, if you're interested in geospatial, interested in database indices and why certain decisions are made, is a very interesting read. And under the hood, Cockroach is using Google's S2 geospatial library.
Gotcha. Very interesting. All right, cool. Interesting article. The past, present, and future of cloud-native API gateways. I think I pulled this one. I just threw this out here. I haven't really watched this one yet. I got to be honest with you. It was on my list of things to do, but I'll tell you my motivation for it, which was, I've been again, and you'll hear this all the time on this show, but I've been wrestling with, containerized applications versus serverless applications, and working right now on a blog post on kind of some how-tos on the serverless side of things, where, how you would approach building your services, testing them in isolation, testing them kind of in context, locally, so you can speed up the development process, accessing data in databases, let's say like DynamoDB or whatever on a Docker side, versus like running individual microservices. And one of the things you run into if you start deciding to kind of assemble a couple of these services together to test them is you need to run them in a localized simulated API gateway. So that was that was in my mind as I saw this particular article. And so, like, for example, I think it's called Start API is the command on serverless SAM, which is AWS's product, that what it does is it fires up an API gateway, which is basically just an endpoint that has URL paths that point to the individual services, microservices, lambdas, single function pieces of code. And so there's that. But I wanted to watch this anyway. So Daniel Bryant discusses the evolution of API gateways over the past 10 years, current challenges of using Kubernetes. And this is the same thing, right? You've got containers and you've got single entry services like lambdas. Putting them all together behind one kind of facade, so to speak, is what an API gateway would give you. So this is kind of looking at where they are, where they're headed, and the future. And I know, for example, that that's one of the things you use if you want to kind of federate everything, but make it easy from the front end to hit things, and you don't care where they come from, right? So maybe you start off with a legacy application that's sitting over in EC2, and you start breaking it apart into multiple lambdas or even Docker or containers for kind of groups of microservices. They can still look like one endpoint to the front end. That's what an API gateway's job is. So, unfortunately, I put this in the bookmarks. I'm like, oh, yeah, this. And I thought it was you. And then I realized, no, that was me. So anyway, if you're interested in reading about API gateways, check it out. But they're definitely something you would end up using when you're kind of pulling different services together and you want one kind of choke point or control point of things like security and exposing them under a web service path. All right. TinyML.
All right. So I ordered a book the other day. This is not new. So in terms of DevNews, it's not new or anything, but TinyML is essentially, running machine learning on embedded devices, on devices that have a low amount of memory, that may be running on a real-time operating system or not, and that have low power consumption. So think like something in the milliwatts, something that can run on a coin battery or lithium-ion thing for hours, days, weeks, even years. And these machine learning libraries and models are becoming small enough that you can actually run them on these really small embedded devices. For example, like you look at your Amazon, Alexa, or your Echo Dots, or Google Home, stuff like that. Just think of something like wake word recognition, like "Hey Google" or "Okay Alexa" type stuff. Recognizing that wake word, that's machine learning. It can deploy a very specific neural network to recognize that phrase specifically, but that can be basically compressed and run on a very small library, TinyML, TensorFlow Lite, on an embedded device, an Arduino, an ARM chip, things like that. So I'll put a link to the TinyML book later, but this article basically kind of goes over at a high level what is TinyML and why is it important, and that you can make things that used to only run on laptops or phones now run on really, really small devices. So you can push the smarts more and more to individual devices out there so they can do things like, make certain decisions or filter data or do things without having to talk back to the cloud, stuff like that, because they're deploying the whole model. Anyway, if you're interested in machine learning, I would definitely take a look at it. I think it's an easy way to get into machine learning. You can use things like Jupyter Notebooks or Google Colab and Python and basically start getting some data and doing the examples, putting models together, and then basically you take a model and then you basically format it for running on an Arduino or something like that. So it's compressed, it's in C. So easy way to get into machine learning. A couple years ago, or maybe 4 or 5 years ago now, I took a machine learning course on Coursera by Andrew Ng, which was really good. And it kind of straddles the, like, not having to do much math, but knowing a little bit of it. And I was like, well, this stuff's so complicated, I'm never going to be able to do it for real or learn it. And I kept staying away from it because I'm one of those guys that don't like to do something without really learning how it works underneath. But machine learning is just too big and too many things with stats and calculus and stuff like that in higher level math. So I think it is at a point now where you can learn machine learning without having to get into all that. And as long as you have someone that maybe has more knowledge or someone to bounce ideas off of and review what you're working on, you can use things like TensorFlow and its higher level API, Keras, to learn machine learning and potentially even use it on real projects out there without having to know everything there is to know about statistics and calculus.
Gotcha. Great resource. And I found that course. It looks like he's running it actually coming up in December 21st, an updated version, I guess. So that's good to know. At Stanford, of all things. All right. Here we go. Santa's going to visit the International Space Station?
Yeah.
Yay.
So, the local company Cesium, they do 3D geospatial data analysis and processing. Really well known and the leader in that space. Every year they do the Santa tracker, NORAD thing, which is awesome, and you can actually see where Santa is in real time, and they use all the data and processing and analytics and graphics stuff that they have to pull that off. But this one's really cool because they're going to be visiting the International Space Station. So I wanted to just shout out Cesium. We've worked with them before. Really great team, great people, super smart guys, and this is really cool for I'm going to definitely have my daughter look at it. I think she's going to get a kick out of it.
Yeah. Good picture.
Yeah.
Very cool. Good group. Yeah, I know these guys. Absolutely. All right. First glimpse of Cesium for Unreal. Is that?
So this is also Cesium. But what they're doing is, so Cesium does a lot, like I said, a lot of the 3D geospatial stuff. So they collect data from all sorts of things, and they're the kind of leader in getting that data, analyzing that data, and geospatial mapping. Well, they're taking this data and their expertise and providing it, working with NVIDIA, Epic, Microsoft, right? Providing that to the Unreal Engine, which if any games out there, this is really cool because now you're blurring that line between reality and virtual reality.
Oh.
You're taking real data that's being updated in real time and feeding it into a game engine. So there's so many possibilities with this. It's like, I could talk about it forever, but it's really, really freaking cool.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay. This is cool. Makes me wish I was actually a game developer. I would have a blast with this. That's really cool. Look at that.
And then imagine putting like a VR headset on and there's just, I think the next 20, 30 years of gaming and VR and AR and stuff is going to be mind blowing.
This is like the Microsoft Flight Simulator, right? So Microsoft Flight Simulator, I used to be a big Flight Simulator nerd as a kid. No kidding, right? Do I have the word? Yeah, I have to admit it. Do I have the word Commodore 64 nerd on my head? I probably should. But yeah, I used to fly these flight simulators all the time, and it was always about trying to get accurate, real-time-ish data somehow from some feed of data. And I know they've now been doing that at Microsoft, where we're getting not real time, but they're getting accurate data from these types of tools for a flight simulator that just got released. Unfortunately, it doesn't run on my Mac, but you could do your same kind of thing. You could have like a virtual flying anywhere and checking things out kind of tool like this. And the Unreal Engine, that just makes that so cool. All right, anyway, nerding out on this. And you have one more. I'm sorry, no, that is it. Okay, cool.
That's it, yeah.
All right, great. Well, that's our dev news for today for the Tech Chat Tuesday. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any feedback for us, please hit us up and send us a tweet on @TechCast. You can email me at techcastfeedback@chariotsolutions.com. We'd love to hear from you there as well. And otherwise, you can subscribe to the podcast for the Chariot TechCast, which this is a feed entry of at chariotsolutions.com/TechCast. Which is the page I showed you earlier that has RSS and RSS and iTunes links. And also visit us over on YouTube. One thing I want to point out is on YouTube, we've got a ton of resources. Let me show you here. So we've got videos going way back to like 2012 even, in different playlists from all of our different shows, all of our Philly Emerging Technology for the Enterprise conferences. By the way, if you have any year-end budget to send people to conferences, $70 is nothing to spend. And it's a great conference. So just to kind of plug our ETE conference again, that's at 2021.phillyemergingtech.com or just phillyemergingtech.com. But all of them are there in playlists. We've done other different shows. For example, we had a whole show featuring Internet of Things on AWS in 2019. We've done, some other things as well over the years. I don't know why I only have a few of these right now. But anyway, the point being there's a lot of content on youtube.com/Chariot Solutions. All right. So with that, I'm Ken Rimple.
I'm Sujan Kapadia.
And we will see you next week. Take care.
Take care.